Paranormal Dimensions is a regular feature on Mondays on the Paranormal UK radio network.
Hello, this is Michael Feely, and you're listening to the Paranormal UK radio network, the UK's biggest paranormal network, and this is Paranormal Dimensions with David Young.
Hello and welcome to the show. Thank you for that intro, Michael. Right, now today's guest is Anthony Peake, and his latest book is called The Hidden Universe, an investigation into non-human intelligence. Anthony Peake is a rapidly developing a reputation for being one of the world's original thinkers in the study of altered states of consciousness. His work focuses on finding scientifically based answers to the great mysteries of human consciousness, from near-death experiences to the reality behind encounters with extraterrestrials. So this is going to be a fantastic talk. I know he's highly sought after. Anthony's been doing lots of interviews lately, so I'm very lucky to get him on the show. Hello, Anthony. Welcome to the show.
Hi, great to be on. I'm looking forward to it.
It's fantastic to have you on. I'll tell you what, just before we start, I'd just like to read a couple of little reviews about your new book. I think it sort of might set the picture for what we're sort of in store for with your new book and several of your other books. I think you're up to about 10 now at the moment.
11. It's 11. This is the 11th.
11. Oh, right, there you go. 11. So, my apologies.
No problem.
Well, one of the reviews is a fantastic book, Peake. Well, it should say Mr. Peake, really, I think. But Peake manages to cover a number of different subjects while tying them all together seamlessly. His enthusiasm leaps off the pages, and his scientific explanations really make sense. It's my first book by the author, and I will certainly be seeking out his other titles. If you're interested in altered states of consciousness, the UFO phenomena, the occult, etc., then I highly recommend this super stuff. Right, and one more little review. Yet another intelligent and insightful book by one of my favourite authors, meticulously researched as usual. Anthony delves into the history of encounters with non-physical entities while weaving a plethora of information contained within the book into a fascinating conclusion. Excellent, thoroughly recommended for anyone with even a passing interest in the subject matter. So there you go, Anthony. It's quite a lovely couple of reviews. There are more, but I can't sit there reading reviews. But
hard act to follow.
Yeah, it's fantastic to have you on the show. I know you're highly sought after. As I've just told you before we came on the show, I've just signed up for a talk you're going to be doing in Hastings called Cheating the Ferryman. It's on the 1st of April, so we can advertise that a little bit later if anyone wants a ticket. But anyway, can we talk a bit about your new book? And you can take it wherever you like. You can go back for, over to you, Anthony.
Yeah, well, the new book is really the culmination of probably, over 50 years of my personal interest in extraordinary human experiences. Starting off right from the mid-1960s, late 1960s, when I first became interested and intrigued in the UFO phenomenon. Indeed, I recall being very disturbed. I remember reading, I think it was Brad Steiger's book, Flying Saucers Are Hostile, which I think was Brad Steiger, I remind, but sadly Brad is no longer with us to correct me on this. But I remember being quite disturbed by that, and I'm originally from the Wirral in the northwest of England, and I remember going on a day trip to New Brighton with my parents, and I remember being on the beach in New Brighton, being terrified about the idea of cows being mutilated, and the idea of these alien entities. Remember, there's a horse called Snippy,
Yeah.
that had been mutilated somewhere in Wyoming or somewhere, and it really played on my mind. But I then became fascinated by the whole idea of extraordinary human experiences, and I think over the years I've never stopped reading about it. When I went to university, I studied sociology, and the sociology of belief, sociology of religion, the sociology of language, and also I was interested in, sort of ghosts, poltergeists, these kind of things.
Yeah.
But I've always taken a very scientific approach. And the new book is an area that I'd always wanted to visit, because my first love and interest has always been the UFO phenomenon, although I've moved into many other areas since then. But this was the book I would have probably loved to have read when I was 12 or 13 years of age, I think. And I've written this book for my readers, but also for myself, I think, because it's expunging a lot of the things I've been fascinated in for a long time.
Right. I mean, I've got to admit, I haven't actually got the book yet, but I'm going to, because obviously when I see you in about 4 weeks' time, I'll hope to get a signature in it. So, will you be having some books there?
I will be, yes. No, it's one of the few events that I'll actually be driving to, because I live down in West Sussex anyway, so it's fairly easy for me to get down to Hastings. But the book really, I don't know how aware you will be of my work, or necessarily your listeners be aware of my work, but as my starting premise, I always take the viewpoint of an Italian skeptic called Marcello Trui, who wrote the very famous words, oft quoted and oft thought was Carl Sagan, but wasn't, where he said, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And this has always been my approach. Whereas you'll read other writers who write about UFO phenomenon, near-death experiences, out-of-the-body experiences, they will just be a collection of anecdotes, a collection of, this is what happened to Joe Bloggs, this is what happened to various individuals. I do that, but what I do is I'm seeking out explanations. I don't want to just take the fact that, somebody sees an alien grey.
Yeah.
I want to know, what's the neurological reasons for that taking place? If we say it is an hallucination, what do we mean by an hallucination? So I go back, and my readers will know this from my work, that if you read one of my books, the last 20 or 30 pages will be references. So I'll refer you back to the documents, I'll refer you back to the academic papers, the academic research, so you can make up your own mind. And whether you can come to the similar conclusions to myself, it's up to you. I'm your guide, as it were, in the books, and I take you and I show you the evidence and say, but in the final analysis, it's up to you to make your own mind up as to whether I make my case or not. Now, in this particular approach, I'm fascinated by entities that people experience in altered states of consciousness, be they near-death experiences, out-of-the-body experiences facilitated by what we technically know in the scientific field, entheogens. These are substances like dimethyltryptamine and psilocybin, LSD. And when people encounter these beings, are the beings just literally figments of your imagination? Are they creations of your subconscious? If they are creations of your subconscious, how does your subconscious create them? For instance, I'm a writer that has always been intrigued by the term used, hallucination. And this is the scientific label used for extraordinary experiences that are experienced by a single person, that aren't experienced by other people. But this doesn't mean they're not real. Just because they're experienced by a single person does not mean they are not real. The word hallucination does not mean it's unreal. What it means is nobody has shared it. And of course, science is very clever at this wording, because you'll get the situation if two people have an extraordinary experience, it's a folie à deux. And if a large group of people, like for instance at Fatima when the sun spun in the sky in 1917 or whenever it was, that is then considered to be a mass hallucination of the crowds. But none of these communications are explained. For instance, if somebody turns around and says two people see a UFO and an alien creature, and they both see the same thing, it's a folie à deux. But scientists can't explain the mechanism by which two brains independently can see the same thing unless they have to accept telepathy is taking place. And if they have to accept if they're using telepathy as the explanation, they're effectively using one thing that they have profound problems with to explain something that they have greater profound problems with. So to me, these things have to be looked at in greater detail. They don't necessarily have to be taken at face value, but what they have to do is be reviewed as cold, as definite as they possibly can. Because I think that it is within these extraordinary experiences that we will discover the really big answers to the really big questions. What I am, what is my consciousness, what is my purpose, what is my reason for being? And it will, for instance, in my books, I go into great detail about quantum physics. Mm-hmm. But unlike a lot of writers, I don't just go into quantum physics. For instance, when I research quantum physics, I speak to quantum physicists. I spend time trying to understand the maths whereby quantum physicists come to their conclusions. I don't just use glibly the term, the quantum field. I want to know what the quantum field is. I want to know why science believes the things it does. I want to understand what dark matter is. I want to understand what non-location is, what superposition really is. And I can then use them and put them in a language that an intelligent layperson can understand, and can then say, oh wow, I'd never really realized what we meant by the Copenhagen interpretation. I didn't really understand what we fully meant by the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen EPR paradox. But these are all incredibly weird effects that modern scientists know take place. And they readily mention these things, but never ever think to apply them to extraordinary human experiences such as the UFO experience, the abduction experience, and everything else. So that's my raison d'etre, and that's the whole reason for the book.
Yeah, I can understand what you mean, because we all hear these terms, don't we? And you sort of just brush them aside and think, well, yeah, but when you actually think, well, what do they actually mean? And I know you do go to great pains to explain what they actually mean in your books. I read your first book. Oh, well, no, I think it was your second book. Was it The Demon? About 10 years ago.
Right.
And I found it absolutely fascinating. But I think I might need to read it again, because the trouble is with me, retaining knowledge is not something that's quite easy. But
what might be a solution here in regards to The Demon? I don't know if you know, but literally 2 weeks ago, I spent 6 days in studios in North London, and we're going to be bringing out an Audible version.
Oh, great!
Of The Demon. Yeah, so that my book is The Life After Death: The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die, which is my first book on near-death experiences.
That's right, yeah.
And trying to come up to a conclusion what happens to human consciousness at the point of death. That is already in Audible. The Daemon is coming out this summer, and my third book, The Labyrinth of Time, that came out in September. And also this book that we're talking about today, that will be probably out in Audible probably towards the end of this year. Because interestingly enough, I have to audition to read my own books. Because
how does that work?
Well, it's because you have to have an ability. I know it sounds bizarre, but you have to have an ability to be able to read in a way that somebody will follow you.
Oh, yeah.
And usually people who read books are not the authors, because authors are not necessarily people who can deliver and have the cadence of voice and things. And apparently my voice is a perfect pitch, because my voice is comparatively deep, and it is therefore perfect for reading books. But it does mean as well that I'm both the talent who has read the book and also the author of the book. So it works out extremely well for
I can understand what you mean, actually, because there are some writers that are not very good at putting it over in spoken word. I have actually seen that work myself, so yeah.
Well, having said that, as a humorous aside, in the Damon book, one of the major areas I write about in that book is déjà vu, the experience of thinking you've experienced something before. And one of the things in school I never did was French. I did various other foreign languages, but I never did French. So my French pronunciation is virtually non-existent and bordering on the bizarre. And the amount of French phrases and words and names that were in that book. And when I was reading it, I could see as I was reading the page, and I could see on the next page another French term was coming up, and I knew that I would stumble on it. It's not fun. You have to go over the same word over and over again. But I think it was worthwhile. I really quite enjoyed it.
Talk about that. The funny thing I think there is that I did do French at school, but can I remember any of it? No.
It's one of those things, isn't it?
Yeah. I think I remember one word, il fenêtre, the window, but that's about it. For some strange reason. Yeah.
My favourite French word, which amuses my wife no end, is voiture. I love voiture, car. Whenever I see it, I will say it and everything else as well. But because I did have passable Italian, I can probably make a fairly good stab at French, written French, and I can probably read it vaguely. But it's the pronunciation; it's so bizarre. because it just is. It's not like English,
No.
you know. But then again, English is a bizarre language in terms of pronunciation as well. But
yeah. I mean, I think
we have drifted away.
Yeah. Well, I think we're lazy anyway with learning languages, the English, aren't we? We think everyone should be speaking English.
But the problem is, I mean, for instance, 2 of my books are about to go into Greek, which is my favourite language, my favourite country. So I'm delighted about this, and we can touch base about this later, because we're going to be doing a very exciting event in Greece this summer. But I was delighted it was in Greek, but whenever I go to Greece, the problem is you will speak to Greeks in Greek, and they'll hear you as if you're speaking in English, and they'll just speak back to you in English, so you never bother.
Yeah.
So you give up. You know.
I saw the little award they gave you, the Parthenon.
Oh, I know, it's good, that one, isn't it? Yeah, I bought my wife a couple of years ago. I bought my wife this book of cardboard cutout objects from around the world, and we decided we'd try and do the first one, which was the Parthenon, which we did over the weekend, and made a pathetic mess of it. Yeah. But I just thought it was so funny that, particularly that I'm going to be in Athens in a few weeks' time, to actually put that up.
Lovely. I just hope the weather improves a bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I'm over in Spain this weekend, so I'm just hoping that the weather's going to be better down there than it is here. But one of these things. But the whole Greek thing is going to be really good, because we're going to be recreating Plato's Cave. I touched upon it before when we were talking, and do you know of the event we did last year in Dracolo Caves in Worcestershire?
I do a little bit, but I was going to actually excuse me, I was going to ask you about it. So please, please tell us about it.
What we did was, in the late 1930s, the British government realised that war was going to take place with Germany, and they realised they were somewhat exposed in terms of the factories they had around the country in terms of making armaments. So they employed Rover cars in the Midlands, in Birmingham, to literally hollow out a factory inside a sandstone outcrop in a place called Dracolo, just outside Kidderminster. And over a period of about a year, they built what they called a shadow factory. And there's 5 miles of tunnels in this hillside. Wow. That was only declassified about 6 or 7 years ago. And literally, it is amazing. There's a hospital down there. There's a theatre where performances, Vera Lynn sang there. And after the war finished, it was kept secret, because it then became a nuclear bunker. And it was a nuclear bunker where Princess Anne's family would have been sent had nuclear war broken out. But one of my readers, one of my associates, has been doing research there. He's a PhD psychologist. And he's been doing research in the caves, because Dracolo is an incredibly strange place. It's profoundly haunted. And Dracolo as a name is very, very weird. Dracolo means Dragon's Hill in Anglo-Saxon. And the Drake, as in the dragon in Anglo-Saxon lore, is not like the dragon of Game of Thrones. This is an entity. This is a protection spirit that can be very, very dangerous, a drake. Now, what is in fact even more peculiar is on the hillside itself, outside, magic mushrooms grow, psilocybin.
Yeah.
So there's a double link here. But also, and this is very intriguing, is that Dracolo in about the 12th century had the first case I've ever come across of zombies, whereby a group of people who had been buried, so the legend goes, dug themselves out of the grave and walked through the village, which again is creepy. So the place really has this incredible aura about it. And we decided what we would do is that through the ministrations of this psychologist guy, that we would do an event there. And we decided we would create Plato's Cave. Now, the myth of Plato's Cave is the idea that it was put forward by Plato, surprisingly enough, the ancient Greek philosopher. And Plato was trying to show, and it's something I do in my writing, is that you can't, just because you're perceiving something, doesn't necessarily mean it's an accurate reflection of what reality really is. Because we know that the brain processes everything you perceive. And we know that what we think is solid matter is 99.99999999996 empty space. Okay? And what is actually solid is ephemeral in the highest degree. So literally nothing is what it seems. And Plato wanted to show this, and he came up with an idea of imagine a group of people who, from their date of their birth, have been chained to looking at the back wall of a cave, and they can't move their heads; they can only look at the back wall. And the back wall behind them, between them and the wall, or behind them, they're next to the wall. There's the wall, there's them, and then there is a walkway behind them and a fire behind the walkway. And people walk up and down the walkway with cardboard cutouts. And what happens is the fire reflects the shadows on the back wall of the cave. And the people can only ever see the shadows on the back wall. And they believe that that's all the reality is just the shadows on the cave. What happens is one of the prisoners loosens his bonds, looks round, walks past the fire, realizes that the whole world he's believed is real, is in fact just shadows on the wall, walks outside to the entrance of the cave and realizes there's a much greater reality out there than he'd ever believed. He walks back to the other prisoners and says, hey guys, you're not going to believe it. The world is not like what you see. It's not shadows on the wall. It's much more amazing. And of course, they think he's crazy. They think he's mad. They think he's got schizophrenia or something. Now, this is the argument I use, that the reality we see is not what it really is. What was really out there is a term called naive realism that consciousness studies people use, academics use, for people who believe that what I see is what's really out there, because it isn't. Okay. So we created this in the caves, and we took a group of people round. I was dressed in all purple. My associate, Samantha Treasure, who was with me, we then also recreated the myth of Persephone and the way in which Persephone's daughter, Persephone was Demeter, was the goddess of light and goddess of the crops in ancient Greek times. Her daughter was abducted by Hades and taken into the underworld, and we recreated all that as well. And it was uncanny. It was incredible. We also had machines we call the lucid light machines, which are machines that bring about altered states of consciousness using flashing lights, and they bring about out-of-body experiences. We had other people using virtual reality headsets to give them the feeling that they were outside of their body, so putting them into a light hypnotic state. And then we took them through the caves. Now, these caves, some of the poltergeist activity down there is just astounding. There were noises when we were there that were difficult to explain. But the psychologists working down there have told me that some of the things that happen down there are just unbelievable. You know, there's poltergeists everywhere, there's sounds, there's noises, there's screams. It's quite a creepy place. And the intention is that next summer we're going to reproduce this in the original Platos Cave, which is just outside Athens, in a hill called Hymettus. And literally this is the set of caves that Plato used as the basis for his idea. And this has never been done before.
That sounds
amazing.
Time. Yeah.
It's going to be the first time since, the 3rd century BC that this has been attempted. And my new Greek publisher is very keen to actually help with this. My new Greek publisher, the owner, he actually knows the Greek government and the Greek Minister for Tourism. So we're going to see if we can really do something extraordinary in this event. And of course, this is all to do with like alien encounters. You know, in ancient Greeks, people taken up in the air and taken into flying machines. You know, it all.
And that's going to be filmed as well, is it?
Yes, yeah. In fact, the Dracula Caves was filmed. If you go onto YouTube and put in Dracula Caves, Drakelo, Dracula Caves, and you put in either Anthony Peake or Lucid Light Machine, you'll actually find the trailer. We're still waiting for the full film to come out, but the trailer itself is very effective.
Excellent.
It really gives you the idea of what we're doing. But this one will be filmed, yes. And we're hoping we'll be filming it using some quite interesting techniques. In fact, next week I'm being filmed. There's a group of guys coming over called the Dreaming Jaguars, who are a couple of guys who work with David Attenborough, doing his graphics, you know, of his animal things, and his world things. They're experts on drone filming, so they're going to be filming me wandering around the forests down here, talking about my ideas, with being followed by a drone, and the drone will be zooming in and everything else. So we're doing some quite interesting stuff at the moment. It's all quite exciting times.
Yeah, sounds it. Do they ever do ghost hunts and things at the Dracula tunnels?
They do indeed. Yeah, if you just go onto their website, Dracula Tunnels, they do ghost hunts. Yeah, no, very much so.
I would have thought quite a few teams would have been interested in doing something like that. But yeah, it sounds.
one of the most uncanny things I've ever seen was there, and he showed me, the psychologist showed me some film that another group of researchers had filmed, and we were looking down one of the corridors into the darkness, and there was a doorway at the bottom, and he said, see that doorway you're looking at? And then he showed me this film on his phone, and there was something standing in the doorway, and the only thing I can describe it was a star being. It was a human shape, and it was like you were looking through into stars. I don't know if you ever recall how old you are, but there was an album by the band called Free.
Yeah.
Way back in the early 70s. Yeah. I think it was called Tons of Sobs. And in it you have a figure. Oh no, even better analogy is the old grey whistle test.
Yeah, I remember all that.
The guy that kicks. That figure, it was like that. And it was made of stars.
Yeah.
It was made of stars. I've never seen anything like it.
Wow.
I really haven't. He said, genuinely, this is what they filmed. This is not special effects. It's what they filmed. And these are the kind of things that are down there. So if anybody's interested, get hold of the Drakelow Caves website, go down there and experience them. You will never experience anything like it. Well, it's extraordinary.
Well, everyone listening, I mean, I will put lots of links on, because I've got a Paranormal Dimensions page which goes with this show. So I'll put as many links and things to you and your books and all this sort of thing and, on the page anyway. So, that sounds excellent. Oh, I wish I wasn't going to Greece now, would you? But there you go. But no, it sounds really good. Right, now I don't know where to go with what next with you.
People don't when they come across my work. It's it's an extraordinary experience I have with people because I'm over in America. I'm doing a big event. I'm doing Contact in the Desert in
May,
Indian Wells. In California, at the end of May. And it is interesting that the person who is running this event, who's a massive UFO researcher and everything, she, like you, didn't know a great deal about me. And you'll like this. She read the book The Daemon last weekend, and it's blown her mind. She cannot believe this. And she's saying, oh my God, this book explains so many experiences I've had in my life. So people come to my work expecting one thing, or come to my events expecting one thing, and leave literally with their minds blown. I would say that 95% of people that get involved in my work, I blow their minds. And that, I'm not being vain there. It is just the stuff I deal with.
No, I do believe you. I mean, when I read the Daemon, I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and it did blow my mind. I'll tell you what you might be interested in. My wife actually had a near-death experience. She actually died twice in 2001. Before I knew her, she had a very serious asthma attack. And Jill, she said, well, you might be interested in hearing about it. She had a very serious asthma attack, and she was actually brought back to life twice with the paddles. And she said that she actually died, and she thought she actually went to the light, and she was given the choice as to whether to come back or not. And she chose to come back because of her children. Don't know what you make of that, but...
Oh no, totally. It is so common, this going towards the light and being told that it's not your time and go back. The terminology here, there are, I think, about 9 of these particular standard events or experiences that make up what's called the Moody traits, or the Grayson traits. And Professor Bruce Grayson was one of the guys that put together the Grayson traits. He's a psychiatrist, professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia. And in fact, Bruce was the guy that wrote the foreword to my first book. And he termed that my cheating the ferryman hypothesis of near-death experience was the most extraordinary hypothesis of life after death he had ever come across. Right. And there are many of them, but going towards the light is one of them. Time slowing down is another. Experiencing the being of light. Having a panoramic life review, seeing your life flash before your eyes, having an out-of-body experience and feeling that you're floating outside of your body. All of these are very standard traits, and they are so universal, it is evident that whatever the phenomenon is, it is genuine and it is real. The issue is, what is the explanations? Now, one of the explanations in terms of the tunnel effect will be it's to do with hypoxia and it's to do with lack of oxygen in the body. And what happens is, when this happens, is your eyesight, your periphery vision disappears, and you actually feel like you're falling down a tunnel or you're flying towards a point of light. That is the pat explanation. It is not necessarily the explanation. It is just one. It's joining together certain neurological effects and certain physiological effects to explain something that people experience. But it doesn't necessarily mean it explains it at all. Because it then cannot explain your wife's experience of her then encounter with the beings of whatever descriptions they were, who then told her to go back. And this is the central theme of my new book. It's who are those beings? What are they? What are the motivations? Are they just hallucinations, or are they independent of us?
Yeah.
Now, I conclude they are independent of us, but also part of us as well. It's quite complex, but it's to do with how the human mind, by the act of observation, creates external reality around you. And entities can use your perceptual abilities to manifest themselves in this reality. And they can come through from somewhere else. Now, sometimes these beings may be beneficial, sometimes they might be wanting to be pleasant, but there's also negative entities that also come through as well. So I'm not saying that they're all wonderful, nice beings. And to me, when people experience, for instance, when they have near-death experiences and they experience people who have died, like, for instance, there's one very famous case by a guy involving a guy called Eben Alexander, who was a neurosurgeon, and a very grounded neurosurgeon that didn't believe there was life after death, didn't have any of this. And he came down with a very virulent form of meningitis. And he effectively died. He was on life support system. And when he came back, he had changed completely. The things he had seen when he was in his near-death experience completely revised and changed everything, including one very uncanny scenario where during his near-death experience, he felt he was on the wings of a giant butterfly. And sitting next to him was a young woman with extraordinary coloured eyes, amazing colour blue. And he chats to this girl, and this girl seemed to know him, seemed to be really friendly with him, and explained that it's time, he's not going to stay here, just like your wife, you need to go back, you have things you have to do. And he goes back, and when he comes to, his parents visit, and he starts explaining about his near-death experience, and explains this wonderfully beautiful young woman that he experienced in his near-death experience, and his parents went really quiet. Oh, wow. It was his dead sister that he didn't know existed. Oh, wow. They kept it from him. And the one thing about her was her extraordinary eyes. Now, as Eben Alexander himself said, I cannot explain that. I met my sister and she was dead.
Yeah, he'd never been told about it. Yeah, that's amazing.
No, and he hadn't. He claimed he hadn't. Now, what does this tell us? Did he know subliminally? Did he know, but he didn't know in the sense it was his subconscious? Possibly. But these images that people have in near-death experiences are incredibly similar to experiences people have when they take a substance called dimethyltryptamine. And dimethyltryptamine, DMT, is the most powerful hallucinogenic substance known to man. I work with researchers who research this particular substance. And indeed, I'm working now, one or two of my associates are working on a research project at the Imperial College in London. It's taking place now, where volunteers are taking this substance. This is a fascinating subject. You'll love this. They are taking this substance and they're reporting back their experiences when they're in these altered states. One of them is a postdoctoral researcher called Dr. Carl Smith. Carl told me that when he took the DMT for the first time, they're getting injected intravenously, so they're going into the veins, and then after a few minutes, you find yourself in a totally different place. You crash out your body, and you're somewhere else. It's called a DMT cage. It's like a glass cage you find yourself in. He finds himself in this location, and as he's doing so, an entity, and it's the only word he used, an entity, like an alien, came over to him, stared him straight in the eye, and said, you shouldn't be doing it this way. This is wrong. Do not do it this way. And then it faded back. He came to. 2 weeks later, he's back in the laboratory. He takes the injection. He goes back and he's in the same place. And the very same creature comes over and said, I told you last time, do not do it this way. We do not want you doing it this way. There are other ways to communicate with us other than this way.
Wow.
Now, as he said to me when he explained to me, he said, this makes no sense. If I was creating this as an hallucination, the hallucinations would tell me what I want to hear. They wouldn't tell me things I don't want to hear because I'm creating them. But on top of that, this entity showed independence of thought. It had its own motivations. It was being critical of him. It was concerned that he was doing it wrongly. And I said to him, do you believe that that entity was just a figment of your imagination? He said, no, it was waiting for me. I know when I go back, that same being will be there. It is as real as you are. Wow. It's just it exists in a different level of consciousness.
Wow. The strange thing is, I know a Carl Smith who does hypnotism. It's not the same one, I wonder.
I would think possibly unlikely. He's a guy in his early 40s, bearded, long hair.
No, he's got short hair, this one, but...
right. Okay. I suppose Carl Smith is going to be... Yeah. I think it's Carl B. Smith. He's a Facebook friend of mine. If you want to look him up, just look up Carl B. Smith on Facebook. Yeah. Most of the people I reference here are Facebook friends of mine anyway, and they're easily contactable.
Yeah, it's a Carl with a K, the one I know, so maybe it's...
this is Carl with a C.
Right. Okay.
This is Carl.
So it's not the same one then.
And Carl, interestingly enough, Carl was the guy that did the virtual reality elements of the Platos Caves event, and Carl will be involved with me in the event down in Greece as well. He has a Greek girlfriend called Lena, and she will be helping us with the whole event as well in terms of translating documents and things as well. Wow. But Carl's work is groundbreaking. But a lot of the work is groundbreaking at the moment. A lot of the work that's being done now at the University of Sussex is extraordinary in the sense that,
Well, maybe once you've done all that, maybe you'll come back on and tell us all about it on another show.
Oh, yeah, what is happening now is that the young scientists, the older scientists are now dying off or retiring. And suddenly the fear of losing tenure because you're interested in these things is ceasing. I mean, there was a classic story a few years ago when Britain has only one living Nobel Prize winner, a guy called Josephson. Professor Brian Josephson, quantum physicist, and he's famous for inventing something called the Josephson junctions, which to do quantum effects, using quantum effects in terms of silicon chips and things. And a few years ago, there was going to be a group of stamps coming out about British Nobel Prize winners, and there was going to be a head of each one of them on a different stamp. Get this, Brian Josephson was not allowed to be on the head on the stamp, even though he's the only living British Nobel Prize winner, or of physics. I don't know whether it's of other things. And the reason he was banned was because he's interested in researching telepathy.
Crazy.
He was banned. This is how it works. I do talks with skeptics. I do debates with scientists in London and various other places where we debate our ideas and everything else. The individuals that debate with me and say, UFO phenomena is nonsense, ESP is nonsense, near-death experiences are nonsense, out-of-body experiences are nonsense, they will say that in the debate, and then we'll have a drink afterwards, and we'll be chatting. And without exception, there will be the point where one of them or two of them will say, yeah, I know I say that it's all nonsense, but a few years ago this really strange thing happened to me, and I just wait for them to say it, and then I turn around and I say, so why didn't you mention that in the debate, and why do you not research this kind of thing? And the answer is always the same. I cannot risk my reputation by even talking about these things. And this is how it works. It's censorship, but it's changing.
Yeah.
And this is the thing why I delight, why I do it the way I do it, is because I can argue with them. I can debate with them the finer points of quantum physics. They assume that because I'm a writer on these subjects that I don't know what I'm talking about. I did an event in New York many years ago, and halfway through my talk, this guy stood up and said, I think you're a charlatan. I think it's everything you're saying now you've memorized. I don't. I always do my talks off the top of my head, but he said, you've memorized it. He said, so I'm going to compromise you now. I'm going to ask you to tell me now and explain to me and to the audience Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So I did.
Oh dear.
and he went... And I finished and I said, okay, is that not Heisenberg's uncertainty principle? And he said, yes. And I said, is there anything I said that was incorrect or shows that I didn't understand it? And he said, no. And I said, can we talk afterwards about this? He ran away.
Right, yeah.
He disappeared. He actually left the theatre. Now that is the kind of thing you have to deal with. Rather than face up to the facts, they will run away. And they do this all the time. They do this all the time because they know their paradigm is under attack at the moment. I'm not criticising materialist reductionism and the modern scientific worldview. It has given us some wonderful things. but it is not a complete explanation of the human experience. Until we can explain what consciousness is, until we can explain how the brain can create you and I from inanimate material reacting with electricity, can create our hopes, our dreams, our inner life, our memories. And they're not even at first base. It's called the hard problem of science. We don't even vaguely understand how it can happen. But we have to break out of this idea that all that exists is what is solid and real.
Yeah.
It's nonsense. We exist within fields, electricity. For instance, they don't even know what electricity is.
No.
They know how to use it, but they don't know what it is. They don't know what gravity is. They'll say, oh, it's to do with mass, and larger mass will attract a smaller mass. Yeah, but why?
Yeah.
But how? It's the curvature of space, and it's space curving. Well, that's not really a good enough explanation. There are things, 94% of the universe is missing. It's dark energy and dark matter. We have a name for it, but we haven't got a clue what it is. I would imagine that in 100 years' time, people will look back at this scientific period, and they'll look back on us with the same kind of disdain that we look at the medieval schoolmen with their epicycles and their way of understanding the geocentric universe. And, when Copernicus came along and changed everything. This is the same now. It's embarrassing, but these guys are dying off. And a new breed are now coming up, and these guys are really doing the business.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of, also about these secret societies don't want us to know what's really going on. I think a lot of it's hidden from us. We've been trained to not think about all these things with all the television and films and music and everything else.
Yeah. Well, the literal word of occult means hidden, and the occult sciences are the hidden sciences. For instance, I know there are associates of mine who have come along to my talks who have collared me afterwards and said, everything you're saying is Masonic. And that, I've had other people, I get the strangest of people in my talks who will come along to have a go at me, and they end up becoming my biggest supporters. A few years ago, I had a group of Mormons that came along to one of my talks ready to have a go. And by the end of it, they were giving me signed copies of the Book of Mormon, saying, you must come over to Salt Lake City, because he said, everything you're talking about here is what we teach. And, you go, woo. There's some occult groups. The Servants of the Light are an example. One of the biggest Western occult groups. I've been invited to speak at their groups because they are fascinated by my Damon Eidolon model of reality. And of course, all occult groups are all trying to just attune the lower self into the higher self, finding the God within, which gives you strength. And in the new book, I have a whole section on people like John Dee, and how John Dee was creating what I call egregorials. These are mind-formed entities that you can create by thinking very strongly about them, and you can bring them into this existence. So all of this stuff, and the new book really blows the lid on this. It shows just how these creatures can be created, and they can be created as thought forms. But they use our thoughts to create themselves and create their own independence.
Yeah, I did mention to you just before we started this show that I had Michael Feely on the last show. Now, you've met Michael Feely.
Michael, yes. Yeah, Michael and I did an event at Birmingham last year.
I think you and he are kind of on the same level of... I think he's more interested in the ancient world, basically, but he's very much into the secret arts and secret codes, whereas you are more interested in the mind.
Yeah, I tend, as a trained historian, I tend to believe the cock-up line of history. I don't tend to be a conspiratorial into conspiracies, but this is not because I don't believe that conspiracies self-evidently take place. But I believe that human beings, we are probably far less in control, and nobody really knows what's going on, even at the higher levels. Even at the higher levels of esoteric groups, they're trying to manipulate these things. They're trying to use them, but they very quickly become taken over by these things, because we really do not understand. We are so lack of knowledge at the moment, I think. Funnily enough, I did an interview this morning, and one of the things we were discussing there was just how incredible this universe really is, and how intertwined this universe is and how much more wonderful than we can even begin to understand this is. And how we are now starting to prise open the lid of Pandora's box to realize that this is a simulation. We are existing within a simulation, and it's mind created, and we are in some way trapped within it. I wrote a book on the American science fiction writer Philip K. Dick a few years ago, and this was very much Philip K. Dick's opinion. Now, I know that it's very much in vogue these days, this idea of the simulation argument. And again, I'm not blowing my own trumpet on this, but I've been writing about this for 1.5 decades. You know, this is nothing new to me. And an awful lot of people are now following the same set of clues that I followed 15 years ago. And they're going to come to the same conclusions. Sometimes I feel I'm so far ahead of the curve, nobody knows I'm here. I've already done it, and I've disappeared into the distance. And people are starting to now come to me and say, oh, you wrote about this. Oh, God, you wrote about this as well. And I have. I don't think there's any area of extraordinary human experiences that my hypothesis cannot explain. Doesn't mean it's right, but I can explain it.
Well, I think it goes a long way to being right. I can't see it. I mean, that book you just mentioned, it's out of print at the moment. I believe it's coming back into print, is it?
Which one's this? The Philip K. Dick one?
K. Dick one, yeah.
Yeah, Philip K. Dick, yes. It's not been as successful as we had hoped. I think there are two reasons for this. I think the first one is that I had an editor who decided to actually put starts to each chapter, to put the chapter into historical perspective, and made quite a few errors without me knowing about it. In fact, I didn't see the final draft of the book until it was published, which was slightly frustrating. And I think it also is just a question of people knowing about my work. I mean, that is the major problem as a writer, is if people are not aware of you, unless they come across you by accident, or they hear you on an interview such as this, or they come across you in a bookshop and pick up your book almost by accident, they're not going to know about you. So it's how you get your work out there. And I'm not alone in this. It is a challenge. Of how we're trying to work. And my work tends to get round by word of mouth. I mean, there are literally, in terms of book sales, I'm dodging just under 100,000 books worldwide in 14 years, which is not too bad, by any stretch of the imagination. Well, you can expect that to triple when this show goes out, so. No. Oh, absolutely, without question. I mean, I just know I'm waiting for that. You know, it's one of these things. But I'm hoping that with the American events, that this will take place. Yes. And also, I work with people. To me, we're all wandering around in the dark trying to understand this. And I feel that there are so many of us that all have like Michael, we all have a piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And all we have to do is one day sit down together and put all the pieces together. And then the universe erupts into itself and disappears into a singularity. Yeah. They switch off the simulation because the Sims have realised they're Sims.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you're a follower of David Icke, but I think he started a lot of this puzzle, didn't he, back in the, what was it, the mid-90s or whatever. And then he's sort of...
To a degree.
Yeah, to a degree. I'm not saying exactly, but obviously his research wasn't he was following other people's research as well. But you've all got that, like you say, that little bit of the puzzle, and like you say, it's all going together.
We owe so much though to the early researchers, the Charles Forts of this world. Yeah. We owe things to even people
himself,
and Brinsley Le Portrench, the Lord Clancardy, who wrote a book called The Sky People in about 1963, which was the first book that really Eric von Daniken then took the ideas from. But it was Brinsley Le Portrench, who was an Irish aristocrat in the House of Lords. And that was the first book that I remember. And of course, before that was Powell's and Berger. There were lots of writers. And then we have, of course, the great Jacques Vallée. So many of these people. And of course, somebody that I'm going to be working with closely in the future in developing ideas is Whitley Strieber.
Right, yeah.
The abductee, because he's fascinated by the Damon Eidolon dyad, like most people are, and he's also really intrigued by my egregorial model of aliens and greys. And we're going to be taking that forward as well. And I'm hoping to link with a lot of the major guys in the UFO world in the event in Contact in the Desert. So that's going to be quite interesting as well.
One of the books that set me off on the path, as far as I've got, was apart from Eric von Daniken, was Immanuel Velikovsky, Worlds in Collision. And,
Worlds in Collision.
And Ages in Chaos were some of the early books that I read about. That was probably about the mid-60s. And then von Daniken came along, and that's kind of, it was never looking back after that. Von Daniken kind of blew my mind, and I think even if his theories are not all correct, they certainly make you think.
I think he gets an awful lot of bad press, to be honest. I think that, yes, he made certain mistakes in his original book, claiming that the claws of the bird were in fact runways, the Nazca Plains, these kind of things. But other than that, a lot of his ideas are actually quite interesting, and he has seeded a lot of other people's ideas in terms of this. For instance, in my book, The Infinite Minefield, I'm fascinated by hallucinogenic substances and how these belief systems seem to seed themselves back in Mesopotamia during the Sumerian civilization, and how they then moved into the Assyrian civilization, the Babylonian civilization, and how these ideas then spread from the Fertile Crescent down into India, up into Tibet, then down into Egypt. And some of the symbolism, particularly the symbolism of the pineal gland, particularly intrigued me. And in my books, I deal a great deal with the pineal gland and the way in which but I'd like to say, unlike many writers, I don't just make these statements, I do the neurophysiology and I do the neurochemistry of how it could be that the pineal gland could synthesize from a substance called melatonin, something my associate Beach Barrett in America, an associate of Rick Strassman, argues is metatonin, which is internally generated dimethyltryptamine. And as Rick Strassman, the guy that in the 90s wrote the book DMT, The Spirit Molecule, has long argued that this substance DMT is our reality modulator, and that we have evolved to have this as a neurotransmitter in the brain. And when you take DMT, as I was saying with Carl, you encounter entities. And it's peculiar what the kind of entities people encounter, because they encounter elves, gnomes, pixies. This is going back again. These are tropes. These are entities that have been with us since time immemorial. We just call them different things. We call them greys now. But before then, the Tuatha De Danann in Ireland, there are so many historically. Now, for instance, in the opening sections of my new book, I have a chapter on cave paintings. And I take some of the work of Graham Hancock in terms of his experiences with cave paintings and aliens and cave paintings that are self-evidently greys. But one of the things that I discovered that was subsequent to Graham Hancock's book Supernatural is a group of caves that were actually discovered in 2017 in northern India. And these caves are over 10,000 years old. Nobody's been in there for 10,000 years old. 10,000 years. They've actually radiocarbon dated them. And they've actually found inside cave paintings. And in the cave paintings, they're paintings of greys.
Wow.
Now, the argument that's used here, and this is a fascinating argument, the skeptics will turn around and they will say, well, it's because they didn't know how to paint properly. And these earlier people were painting because they couldn't paint the human figure right. They've elongated them and they've made their eyes bigger. Nonsense. If you look at, say, Lascaux and the cave paintings, they certainly knew how to draw a bison. They certainly seem to know how to draw a giraffe or a tiger or all the other animals. But these creatures, they draw quite specifically differently. And I argue they were drawing the same way as they were drawing the bison. They were drawing what they were seeing. And you see flying craft, and you see these entities with elongated skulls and huge black eyes. My mother saw exactly the same thing as she was coming down with Alzheimer's. These creatures are there. The greys are there all the time. They break through. It's what they are and what their role is.
Yeah. Do you feel they're on kind of a different vibration plane, so that sometimes, maybe when you're taking these hallucinogenic drugs, you become on your mind goes on a different vibration plane and you're seeing things on a different dimension?
Yeah, I think that the issue is, I wrote a book called Opening the Doors of Perception, which is my third to last book. Yeah. And I go into this in great detail of how the human mind, how the brain is an attenuator. The human brain is there to actually stop us experiencing everything that's out there. And critics will say, where do I get that information from? Well, University of Sussex have been doing a series of experiments where volunteers have been taking psilocybin, magic mushrooms. And what they do is, while people are taking psilocybin, they monitor the brain's activity using fMRI scanners. The idea being that when people take these substances, certain parts of the brain will light up, so they will understand what is happening in the brain when these people have these experiences. Much to their absolute surprise, they discovered that psilocybin switches bits of the brain off. It doesn't open up bits of the brain, it switches it off. It stops the brain from stopping you perceiving the wider reality. This is what C.D. Broad, who was an English philosopher, and Henri Bergson, a French philosopher, and subsequently Aldous Huxley in his 1954 book Opening the Doors of Perception, the book that I based my title upon, all these guys concluded that the human brain is there to take out information. If we received all the information that was available to us, we would go crazy. As William Blake said in his famous poem, if the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see reality as it really is, infinite. But we are trapped in the caves of our cavern. Notice caves of our cavern, Plato's Cave, which is a reference to Plato's Cave, that we are trapped in our cavern and we only see the shadows on the back of the cave. What these substances do is, you quite rightly, as your analogy says, it broadens out your perception, your ability to perceive a broader reality. The broader reality I call the pleroma. We are stuck inside what is termed the kenoma. It's a kind of the simulation. But certain substances like DMT and psilocybin, they can actually break you out of that trap. And they can open up your mind to the broader reality. But as the entity said to Carl Smith, that's not the way to do it. Because you wouldn't think of going on a 50-mile hike without training. The same is with, if you just take DMT, you're not prepared for the things you're going to see. You need to be trained. That's why Buddhist monks are trained when they do dream yoga, when they encounter entities and things. They go into altered states of consciousness, but they are trained to know what to look for. If you and I just did it, we'd be lost, and we'd be vulnerable, because we won't know how to protect ourselves against any potentially aggressive entities when we're in this world, this alternate world. So we need to be trained. And the new book I'm working on at the moment with an associate of mine is we're trying to find ways of contacting your own higher self, your own daemon, the part of you that can communicate with these worlds. And we're using certain techniques. I'm a qualified psychometrician, so I can apply psychometric testing to people. There are certain techniques that you can do where you can switch off the dominant hemisphere of the brain. There's something called a WADA, W-A-D-A, which you put sodium amytal into the carotid artery in the neck, and it then deadens the dominant hemisphere, allowing the non-dominant hemisphere to come to the fore, which then allows you to access the broader reality. So we're working on this at the moment. We're not just sitting around talking about it. We're trying to make it happen. And I think when people have alien encounters, when they have alien abductions, when they have close encounters of the third kind, what is happening is their brains are being opened to this broader reality. They're not traveling in outer space. They're traveling in inner space. These are creatures of inner space. These are creatures of psychology.
Yeah.
You know, we look outside, but they're not. They're part of us. They are part of us. They've been with us forever, and they will be with us forever.
Do you feel maybe in the days of the LSD, in the mid-60s, when all the they were tripping out in psychedelic music and everything, do you think that was kind of happening then?
Oh yeah, I think so. But it was slightly uncontrolled.
Yeah.
I think was the problem. I think that, and possibly, I would like to believe that probably LSD and the substances that were being taken then were not quite as focused as the substances that are now available, all of which, by the way, are illegal in the UK, so we need to be very careful about the caveat of this, is that these substances are illegal. But having said that, you can go to other places in other countries where you can take them, like DMT, dimethyltryptamine, that I've been talking about. But there is another substance which is related, which is even more powerful, and that's called 5-MeO-DMT. This is probably the most powerful substance that a human being can take. And funnily enough, it's excreted by a toad in the Sonoran Desert in the southern states of America and in Mexico. Literally, this frog, this toad excretes this stuff.
Oh, right.
And it is incredibly powerful. And indeed, if you're interested, literally went up 2 days ago. I do my own podcast, the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour, and I interviewed a guy called James Orrock, who wrote the definitive book on this substance called Tryptamine Palace. Yeah. This is a book about his own experiences with 5-MeO-DMT. When you take 5-MeO-DMT, you suddenly attune to the greater consciousness. You know that when people have extraordinary experiences, sometimes they will say, I found the God within me. This attunes you into the God within. This actually broadens you. It's called the cosmic consciousness. A guy called Buck wrote a book about 100 years ago about this, about cosmic consciousness. Sometimes we get a glimpse of it. In his famous poem, Some Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, William Wordsworth made these wonderful lines where he said, I have seen the most amazing things in the light of setting suns. And it's the idea that sometimes you can for a split second, glimpse the eternal. You can glimpse that you are part of a greater something. You are part of something far, far wider. But we are denied it. Well, no, we're not denied it because this is where we are in the simulation. But when you take 5-MeO-DMT, you realize that you are not, your ego goes. You are not an ego thing. You are something that is far greater, far broader, and far more powerful. But these individuals, when they take this substance, as I said, they actually go without a guide. When they come back, they're lost because they don't know how to work within this reality anymore. And that's why shamans are trained. That's why shamans are trained from childhood to be able to encounter this world behind the world, to encounter the upper world and the lower world that the shamans call them. Because they encounter entities all the time. People who have classic migraine, as I do, sometimes have glimpses of this world behind the world. People who experience temporal lobe epilepsy experience it even greater. And people who experience schizophrenia is not an illness, it's not a disease. The doors of perception are so widely open that the ego cannot take it, they cannot comprehend what they're seeing. They're in a timeless place. Schizophrenics lose their concept of time, of place, of identity, and it breaks down. And we're not prepared. You have to be evolved to be able to deal with this. And this is what I call the doors of perception are being opened. And all these things that I've been describing here, I think Alzheimer's is involved in this. I think that Asperger's syndrome, autism, autistic children. You look at the classic cases of autistic children, they can't take sound. It's because they cannot cut out, they are hearing everything. And it drives them crazy. I worked in an autistic school for a year as a consultant a few years ago, and assisting them on one or two projects. And these children were telepathic. Everybody in the school knew that the kids were telepathic. There's no clocks in the house, but they knew what time it was. There are children there that can calculate the most amazing things, but can't tie their shoelaces. You give them a number, they'll give you its square root. You know, it's just phenomenal what they can do. Their brains are working at a different level. And this is why science has to realize they need to be looking at these things, analyzing them and understanding why they happen, not pretending they don't happen, which is what they do.
Yeah. I think we should all be looking at these people in different light, actually, after what you've just said, you know.
Totally.
And try to understand what's actually going on inside.
Well, as Whitley Strieber said to me, you know, they thought when he had his encounters with the Greys, the first thing they tried to diagnose on him was temporal lobe epilepsy, which was not diagnosed. But I believe, and I'll be meeting him and discussing this with him in California when we do the event. We're doing a workshop together over there. And I'm convinced that he may not be temporal lobe epileptic experiencer, but he's definitely experienced something on the temporal lobe epileptic scale. Because the symptoms that people have when they have TLE are extraordinary. I have seen a lady who has had TLE, and I've seen her in a TLE situation where she predicted what was about to happen next, and I saw her do it. I actually saw her do it. I saw her predict that her son would come through the door of a shop while she was in what's called an absence state. And while she was in the absence state, she said something to me, and she said, he shouldn't be here. And as she did so, her son walked through the door of a shop.
Wow.
And this is just uncanny. And I saw that happen. I saw that happen. I know that happened. So I know she was precognitive. Because of the sets of which I'll go into detail, the sets of circumstances led me to believe. I know other people who have temporal lobe epilepsy see the future all the time. I know one guy who's continually deja vuing. He has deja vu situations almost continually. He knows what's going to happen in the next few seconds. You know, deja vu itself is evidence that you and I and everybody on this planet who has deja vu has lived this life before. We're not here for the first time. If you get deja vu sensations, it's exactly what it senses on the tin.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
You are living your life again.
That's really fascinating.
And you're living your life. Well, it's because it's a simulation, and it's like a computer game. You live your life over and over again, like you play a computer game. And this is what we're doing. I call this cheating the ferryman. This is my overall hypothesis from my first book. And in fact, you would have come across it when you read The Daemon. You probably don't remember, but I discuss The Daemon is the book for the evidence of the hypothesis that's put forward in the first book.
Yeah, I do remember generally what it was about, but I can't sort of remember the whole book. But so I think I might need to sit down and read it. Actually, I'll get your audio book when it's out.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I do discuss. I mean, the first book is already out on Audible,
yeah.
So you can get that now.
Because the interesting thing is then when you're driving, you can be listening to it while you're driving, which is great.
Absolutely. Well, because my writing style is very personal, so I'm writing to the reader. It lends itself very much to Audible. I know people that listen to Audible helps them go to sleep because I bore them so much. You know,
I don't think so.
Said many times. Tell me your theories and you'll put me to sleep. You know.
No, I don't think so. Have you had out of body experiences of your own?
I had the first lucid dream about 6 months ago, and it stunned me. I am still recovering from it because it was so extraordinary. I was dreaming I was in a nightclub, and I came out of the nightclub and I walked down the alleyway down the side of the nightclub. And as I did so, I looked at my feet. And I thought, why am I looking at my feet? And then I realized I was lying in bed. And I thought, but you can see you're in an alleyway. And I thought, oh my God, I'm dreaming. And I became aware for the first time in my life in a dream. And I thought, what do I do now? And I thought, I know, I'm supposed to fly. So I tried to lift my feet off the ground, and I fell to the ground. I banged my knees on the ground. And then I tried again, and I found myself lifting up. And I lifted up, and the back of the alleyway was a brick wall. I flew over the brick wall. I can still see it in my mind's eye now. I flew over the brick wall, and then I was flying over this. It was late at night, and it was a beautiful bay. And there were cars driving along the side of the bay, and I could see their headlights as they were driving along, as you can when you're in a plane coming in over the sea. And I could see the lights and everything else, and I could feel the wind around me as I was flying. And then I lost it, and I came to, and I was back in my bed again. I was somewhere else.
Yeah, I've had that as well, actually, the flying. Mind you, I think we all probably get those flying sensations. And
the flying sensations are part of normal dreaming as well. It's like the myclonic jerk that you have, you know, the thing when you kind of step, and there's another step. Yeah. That's technically called a myclonic jerk.
Or you think you're falling out of bed or something,
or you think you're falling out of bed. Now, if you get visions just as you're going to sleep, they're called hypnagogic imagery. And when you wake up, it's hypnopompic, because these are areas where you can manipulate your reality as well. But I have friends and associates that lucid dream on a regular basis. I mean, my friend today, she was telling me about her lucid dreams, that she started really lucid dreaming powerfully again, where she'd only lucid dreams which she has out of the body experiences. And when she's had out, she goes to places that she brings back information. Like she went to her mother's house once, and she saw things that her mother had done in the house in terms of flower arrangements and flower pots and things. And she was absolutely right. She'd seen them. There's another associate of mine, Graham Nichols, who you must get on your show. And Graham convinced me that out-of-the-body experiences do take place, and people do get out of their bodies in three-dimensional space, because I believed it was all a kind of hallucination. You went inward into your model of what you think reality is. And I think many people do that. I think because what tends to happen is when you're in these out-of-body states, 90% of the environment is right, but the curtains will be the wrong colour, or people will do different things. And I know Robert Monroe, the famous out-of-body experiencer, cited this many times, and this is called a metachoric model. It's the idea that because all reality is created by the brain, when you travel in what you think is external reality is still brain created, but it's brain creations of external reality. And that's when you overlap. That's when your experiences overlap and you share these experiences. And we are working on this. We're trying to find people who can share out-of-body experiences. And we're getting some quite interesting results. And I'm working with some incredibly talented out-of-body experiencers and trainers at the moment. We're doing some incredible stuff, myself and my associates. It's very exciting what we're doing.
That sounds it. Perhaps you can point Graham in my direction.
I will do. Graham, I'll give you one example of what how powerful Graham's experiences are. Graham has been having out-of-the-body experiences since he was about 6 or 7 years of age, when he realised that the things he was seeing in dreams were actual real places. And he tested it out once when he was a kid, when he saw the name of a street in North London, which he didn't know existed. And he found it in the A to Z. And when he got to the street in question, it was exactly as it had been in his dream. So this is what led him to believe that it was real. But what then happened was, many years later, he was teaching. And while he was teaching, he suddenly felt his legs buckle and he blacked out. He then found himself in another reality. He was in a jungle. He was walking in the jungle. He could feel the heat on him and everything else, and plants all around him. He then walked forward, parted the plants to stand out, and he was standing on the corner of Great Wardour Street and Old Compton Street in Soho. And he's thinking, what am I doing here? And he could hear people calling, saying, Graham, Graham. And it was the people in the studio, in the theatre, the lecture theatre, trying to call him back. He then felt a kid run past him, a lad ran past him. And then he looked down the main street, and he saw an explosion take place halfway down the street, and a pub blew up. And people were falling out of the pub covered in blood. A nail bomb had gone off in the pub. He then feels himself rising up, and he comes to, and the first thing he said to 5 witnesses, signed affidavits, this is 5 witnesses, and he turned around to them and he said, there's going to be a bomb in, and he gave the exact description of the location. Soon there's going to be a terrorist attack. 5 days later, there was the terrorist bomb in the Admiral Duncan pub, the gay pub in Soho, when somebody released a nail bomb. I think 2 people were killed. Wow. 5 days later, in exactly the location he said. Not only was he in an out-of-body experience, he was in a precognitive out-of-body experience. Graham now knows about these precognitive out-of-body experiences because he calls it the Cyrillian effect. He knows that his out-of-body experience is precognitive and in the future because it's towards the blue spectrum. Everything seems to be tinged in blue. We don't know why this is, but we're working on this because we think this has to be significant. It's as if his perceptual schemes have just moved slightly. Yeah. And he's seeing it through a different lens. But we're trying to find out what this is. And Graham and I are planning to work together on this in the future. And if anybody's interested in this, if you go onto YouTube, you put on Anthony Peake and Graham Nichols, you will find me interviewing Graham on the exact spot in Soho that he found himself in his precognitive dream.
Yeah, I'll definitely check that one out. And I'll put the link on the page for it. That sounds fascinating. What you were talking about when you do your talks, strangely enough, you did a talk a while back in Dalston, in the Rio cinema, I think it was.
I did indeed. Well, we're doing it again. We're doing a similar one in a few weeks' time.
Oh, yeah.
With the same documentary. Same documentary. We're having a showing of the same documentary, and there'll be myself and a group of other people on stage afterwards answering questions like this.
At the same venue?
No, it's at a venue in Shoreditch.
Ah.
But I'll send you the link.
Please do. I'd love to come. If I can...
Okay, that'll be great.
That'd be brilliant. But
Jade Shaw is the lady who has done the documentary.
Oh, right, yes.
Graham Nichols. Graham Nichols will be there.
Graham Nichols. Oh, great, yeah, right, brilliant. I'll definitely want to come. I just hope I'm free.
Okay, and also, the part of this has already been put up on YouTube again. Yeah. The actual thing we did at the Rio Cinema is up on YouTube.
Right.
Each of our speeches is up there, so check that out as well.
Yeah, the reason I mention it is because I grew up in that area. That's where I was born, in Hackney and
wow,
in
really?
Dalston. And that cinema you were in, it used to be called the Classic when I was growing up there.
Wow, small world.
It's a small cinema on the corner, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I remember,
yes, she packed it.
Yeah, I remember when they first opened that in the late 50s. I think it was late 50s. Whether it was something there before that, but it used to be like a cartoon cinema, and then they changed it then they changed it into a main feature cinema. But they used to show the older films, the reruns. But
oh yeah, because in Liverpool when I was a kid there were two in the early 60s in Liverpool, the cartoon cinemas as well. So that's a perfect piece of history, isn't it? Cultural history.
I just thought I'd throw that one in there because it's kind of a bit of a synchronicity there. But,
wow. Well, do come along.
No, I definitely would like to come.
And make people come along, because this is going to be a really good event. The documentary is fantastic. Yeah. Eben Alexander is in it, the guy I told you had the out-of-body experience and the near-death experience. We've got some of the world's leading researchers in out-of-body experiences as talking heads, and me, sitting actually interviewed where I'm sitting now. In fact, as I'm doing this interview is where Jade interviewed me for the documentary. So, yeah, no, really good.
Yeah, it's called Inside Out, it's called, isn't it?
Insight Out.
Inside Out.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so it's
Inside
Out.
Out.
My writing.
It's all right. And the lady's called Jade Shaw.
Yeah.
She is married to a guy called Charlie Morley, who also trains people in out-of-body experiences. And Charlie, interestingly enough, when they got married, took her name. He was Charlie Morley, and he's become Charlie Shaw.
Oh, right.
But check these guys out. They do some quite interesting work.
Yeah. I mean, please do send me that link. I'd really love to come, yeah, definitely. But I guess that's about... Well, unless you've got more you want to tell us about. But
no, I probably will have to shoot now, but I think we'll do it again.
Definitely, yeah. But I mean, if anyone out there is interested, perhaps if you've got contact details, you could put out.
Yeah.
I'll put links on the page
absolutely.
as well.
It's really important to me, particularly on Instagram at the moment. I'm only new on Instagram, and I've already got about I think the last count was I was about 890 people. When I get to 1,000, I can actually post direct links on there.
Right.
So if anybody can help by actually liking me and following me on Instagram.
I'm on Instagram, but I've not been on there long myself, but because it's some of those things I couldn't get my head round. Bit like
neither can I.
Like
I
Twitter,
still
really.
Yeah, I still can't. I prefer Facebook, but I need to be on there. And on there, I'm Cheating the Ferryman 54. So look me up on there. I'm very, very, very active on Facebook. On various places. There's just look up Anthony Peake and you find me. The new thing I'm doing at the moment is the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour Facebook wall, and I posted an amazing coincidence that took place this afternoon, which I just posted something on about 2 hours ago, which you might find interesting, to do with Plato's Cave.
I did see that. So you were in Plato Street, wasn't it? Or Plato Road? Or...
Plato Street.
Yeah.
I come from an interview discussing Plato's Cave, and I walk out, and I get myself the directions on Google Maps to actually walk back to Clapham North Station, and I walk down, and the first instruction is turn into Plato Street. And I'm going, my God.
Synchronicity again, yes.
Oh, totally. Synchronicity is unbelievable in my life. So that's Anthony Peake, and also my website, anthonypeake.com. If you're interested in my books, you can just order them in bookshops. You can order them on Amazon. Many bookshops still have them in there. The new book, I know, is in quite a lot of bookshops at the moment. So you can just go in if you want. If you want signed copies of the books, you can buy them directly off my website. All my books are there, with the exception of the Philip K. Dick book, which is now out of print, which might be going back into print, and my book, The Labyrinth of Time, which will be due out again in about 6 months' time. That's anthonypeake.com. If you're interested in my videos like this, or my lectures and everything, I link up with all the lectures I'm doing. This will be linked up on Facebook as well, which is good. But also I have my own podcast, the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. If you go onto my website, just go onto videos, you'll find them all on there, historically about 40 or 50 interviews I've done on there with some of the world's leading authorities, including Graham Nichols And most of the people I've mentioned here, I've interviewed on the Consciousness Hour podcast as well.
Fantastic. You make me feel quite inadequate, really.
No, not at all. Not at all. Not at all. This is good. No. This is good. And thank you for inviting me on your podcast. It really
well, it does go out on the radio as well. It goes worldwide on the radio across America and everything. So, you know. But the thing is, I've been on Coast to Coast about 3 times and things. So they know, certain people know of me, but I just feel they don't know me until they see me actually perform and lecture, and then suddenly it's a whole different ballgame. Like
I'm Tony.
Sorry, it's a bit like Michael Feely was saying, because they don't really know him too much out there. But I think things are will be looking at for both yourself and Michael in that respect.
I certainly hope so. I mean, the thing is, I always consider that I'm 2 people. I'm Tony. The guy that's talking here is Tony, but the guy when he's up on stage is Anthony. He's a different guy altogether. Right. He's the guy that writes the books. I'm just the human version of him. I'm in awe of him and the things he can do and the things he knows and the things people can ask him questions. And it astounds me where he gets the information from. I have no idea. No idea.
Well, hopefully, if I see you in Shoreditch in a couple of weeks, I'll say hello, Tony.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, say hello, Tony, and if it's the guy on stage, it's hello, Anthony.
Right, yeah.
He's an arrogant shit. I wouldn't bother with him. All right.
Anyway.
Okay, then, wonderful to talk to you.
Yeah, it's been fantastic.
Okay,
thank you very much, Anthony.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye. Thanks again.
Yeah,
bye-bye.
And you. Bye.
You've been listening to Paranormal Dimensions. I'm David Young, and this is the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Please tune in again next week.
Paranormal Dimensions is as bright and powerful as our celestial star, the sun. And although it's expending thousands of pounds of energy every minute of the day, have no fear. There's plenty left.
Paranormal Dimensions is a regular feature on Mondays on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
7 or 8 years ago, I received a very, very curious phone call from my mother. And she was in a state of semi-hysteria. Now, a few days before, she'd had a very curious experience whereby she was walking onto the village I was brought up in, and there's 2 people in the audience who actually were brought up on the same village, so will know this. It's a place called Bromley Pool on the Wirral. And a few days before, she'd been walking onto the village, and she had noticed a very, very curious smoke circle in the sky. And she explained it to me, and she said it was like a kind of a circle of smoke that spun, and then suddenly at super fast speed headed off to North Wales, really fast. She then phones me back 2 or 3 days later in this state of hysteria, and I said, "Mum, what's the problem?" And she said, "Tony, you know the way I live alone?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "And I go to bed every night and I close my bedroom door." And she said, "This morning, at the middle of the night, I woke up and I couldn't move." Sleep paralysis, if anybody knows about sleep paralysis. So she obviously was in a state of sleep paralysis. But she said that she then looked towards the bedroom door, and the bedroom door was open. And then she described to me how she saw 5 fingers come round the door, long and thin, and this little creature pop its head round and look at her, blink, and then dodge back as if this creature wasn't expecting her to be actual thinking and being awake. She said, "Tony, what did I see?" Now, my mother would not know a classic grey if it bit her on the bottom. She wasn't of that generation, she wasn't interested in any of these things, but she described in absolute She said it had huge black eyes, it had 2 holes for a nose and a slit for a mouth. But what disturbed me was the way she said it reacted to her. It looked at her and it blinked and looked shocked. The description she gave is a very, very precise one, and a very, very curious one. In 2018, in a place in northern India, they actually found some cave paintings that were 10,000 years old. They were underneath 2 small villages in northern India. The cave paintings depict, among other things, creatures coming down from the sky, and these creatures that had huge black eyes and 2 holes for a nose and slit for a mouth. Roll forward to the work of Graham Hancock. Has anybody read Supernatural? Okay, a fascinating book about dimethyltryptamine, which I'll touch on a little bit later, and various other things. Graham Hancock describes how there are certain cave paintings in the Drakensberg Mountains in South Africa, in a place called the Junction Shelter. And in the Junction Shelter, these paintings are again probably around about 15 to 20,000 years old. In these paintings, they depict exactly the same creatures: the long black eyes, and the slit for a mouth. Not only this, but Graham Hancock points out that there is something called the Dying Man, a painting in Pêche Merle in France, which again depicts exactly the same creatures. So the question here is, an elderly lady in her 90s in Merseyside, modern times, people in ancient times seeing these things and drawing them and depicting them. But it gets more curious. There's a place called Ain Gazelle in modern day Lebanon, and there they have these curious statues that they discovered around about 1984 or 1985. And these statues again depict exactly the same creatures in exactly the same way. So this is some kind of a trope. This is something that goes through history, and you cannot just pretend that it's a modern day phenomenon. I know people will argue and turn around and say it's the cover from Whitley Strieber's book Communion, from way back in the 1970s. That was an image that surely is some form of archetype. Now this thing started to intrigue me, and I started to think, what is going on here? What are these entities, and what do they involve? Now, one of the members of my extended group, again who will remain nameless, is doing research at the moment at Imperial College. And they're doing research where people are taking a substance called dimethyltryptamine. This is a legally sponsored exercise to actually understand what happens in the brain when people take dimethyltryptamine. Now, dimethyltryptamine is one of the most powerful hallucinogenic substances known to man. It's known as an entheogen. The word entheogen actually means to try to discover the God within inside yourself. And what they're doing is they're testing to see exactly what happens when people have these extraordinary experiences, these somehow drug-facilitated out-of-body experiences, or whatever we want to call them. And this associate of mine described to me that he had taken some dimethyltryptamine, and immediately, and if anybody's been involved in dimethyltryptamine, they know that what happens is you kind of suddenly shoot out your body, and you suddenly find yourself in another reality that's actually more real than this reality. And he finds himself in this kind of what they call the DMT cage. And he's in this cage, and suddenly there's this entity, and it comes towards him, and it taps him through the cage, and says, "Do not do it this way, you're doing it wrongly. You should not be doing it this way. Please don't do it this way." He then goes back, comes back into alternate realities, comes back here. 2 weeks later, he does the same exercise, he takes the drug, he ends up in the same place. And the same creature appears and turns around to him and says, "I told you last time, you do not do it this way, you must actually do it other ways." Now the question we have to ask here is, if this was just a part of his subconscious, this being seems to have independence of him. It seems to be part of him but independent of him. In my new book, this is what I'm going to be discussing. I'm going to be discussing the ideas that these entities seem to be part of us, but also seem to be alien to us as well. I call them egregorials. The reason I call them egregorials is that an egregore is a collective, when a group of people come together like we are, there is something that is greater than us because we are a group. It's been known for years when crowds get together, there seems to be a kind of an egregore that's created among them. When my little group meets up, we always discuss ideas and thoughts, and we get excited in the ideas and thoughts. And it seems to be that something greater than us has been created. Now, what is taking place here is it seems to be that people's consciousness seems to be able to create something that is greater than ourselves. Now, in the book, I discuss, not just, as people who've read my books will know this, I don't just make these statements, I back it with science. And I'm particularly intrigued of the implications of these concepts of egregorials and egregorial ideas and egregorial thoughts with what we know about quantum physics and something called the collapse of the wave function. Now, in quantum physics, as you may or may not be aware, is that subatomic particles, until they are measured or observed, do not exist. Seriously, fact. What they are is what's called a probability wave. What that effectively means is that it's a probability wave that a subatomic particle may be found in one location or another location. And depending upon the act of observation or the act of measurement makes the subatomic particle change from being a probability wave to being a point particle that's located in three-dimensional space. But before it is observed or before it is measured, it's nowhere. Now, could this be what reality is? Could it be that what we do is collectively we all here are observing and measuring this environment around us? We create what is called consensual reality because we all agree this is what the consensual reality should look like. It's a collective thing. Could it be that under certain circumstances, other things can be created that can actually use our ability to create the world around us and actually manifest themselves in certain ways? And in this ways, I'm reminded of the writings of a lady called Alexander Neal, who was a French-Belgian lady in the 1920s who spent a lot of time in Tibet. And when she was in Tibet, she created what she called a tulpa, which is a thought form. And what they did was they decided that they would create this little monk, nice rotund little monk, and that the entity then started to come into three-dimensional reality. And it used to follow them round. But then it started to gain independence of them, and it started to get quite malevolent and quite nasty. And in the end, they had to work together to actually destroy this entity because they brought it into existence. A famous case that is very, very similar took place in Toronto in the 1980s, when a group of researchers were playing with a Ouija board. And they decided to test whether the communications they were getting were actually a creation of their own minds or not. And what they decided to do was to actually create a backstory that was totally fictional of a young man who was living in 17th century England. They gave him a name, they gave him a location and everything. This entity then started to manifest itself as if it was independent of them. So yet again we have this feeling that we can actually create in some way or other something that is outside of ourselves but seems to be independent of ourselves. So the term egregore is the term I use. I also suggest that egregores probably exist in what I call the pleroma. Now, the pleroma is a Gnostic term, and it is the reality behind this reality, the place that you can go when you're in altered states of consciousness. Now, many members of my little group are in the audience at the moment. One of the things we discuss a lot of times are the issues of out-of-the-body experiences, lucid dreaming. And the idea that when you are in an out-of-the-body experience or a lucid dreaming state and you encounter other entities, are these entities again just figments of your imagination, or do they have independence of yourself? In the book I cite many, many cases of individuals who have had experiences that suggest that these entities are independent of ourselves in some bizarre, peculiar way. So historically, what do we think about these beings? Well, in the book I do a full review of the history of these kind of entities, going right back into ancient history, right back to Sumer, to ancient Mesopotamia, into the Assyrian Empire and various other developing civilizations at that time. And these things are found all the time. They are everywhere. They're in every culture. Every culture you go to, you will find these entities. In Islamic culture, you have the jinn, and there are various types of jinn that seem to be created in different ways. within the really ancient traditions, for example, in terms of the non-canonical parts of the Bible, like the Book of Enoch. In the Book of Enoch, they talk quite specifically about a group of entities that actually came down onto Mount Hermon in present-day Lebanon. And these creatures came down and they actually taught the local group how to develop things such as women wearing makeup and these kind of things. Now, if you read the Book of Job, there's some Book of Enoch, there's some fascinating elements in there. Some really interesting ideas that actually have carried through to what we would consider quasi-modern mystical traditions. And in the book I have a whole section on the work of Dr. John Dee and his assistant Kelly, and how they were manifesting what seemed to be entities, egregorials, by using magical techniques and magical processes. We then move on to think about the concepts of something called the Watchers, which actually the word egregorial means. It actually comes back to the term of the Watchers, and the Watchers from both Islamic tradition and from Ethiopian tradition and from various other traditions in the past. So it seems that these entities seem to have some kind of dynamism about them. Now, one of the things that I was also going to mention today was that somebody who sadly is not here today, which is very, very sad, is a guy called Braham Murray. And Braham became a good friend of mine over one of my previous books on the writings and life of J.B. Priestley. Braham, in his autobiography, Anything That Can Go Wrong Will, Braham was a top, I think he was the youngest British director who had a play on Broadway in the 1960s. And he describes a day in 1969, and I'd love to believe the coincidence and the synchronicity that it was actually today 50 years ago. Because he describes how he was wandering through London and he came across a beautiful esoteric bookshop. And he went into the bookshop and he bought one of the volumes by Jung. And after this, he read this book and it fascinated him so much. But what happened was, when he got home that night, he was phoned up by an associate of his. And the associate turned around and said, "There's a guy called Arnold Herningstat who's flying in from Oslo. And I'd like you to go out to Heathrow and pick him up." Braham goes and picks the guy up, brings him back, and over the next few days they become quite friendly. And one day they're having a discussion. And Braham says, and he's talking about the essence of evil. What is evil? Is evil tangible? And this guy goes, "It is the beast." And he said, "The beast is over there." And Braham says in the book, and he told me this many, many times, he said he looked over and there was a chair. And this entity appeared in the chair in 3 dimensions. And it was almost like the Gorgon. It had sort of snakes in its hair, and it looked at him and then turned around and then faded and disappeared. And in the book I mention this and I say, this is intriguing. What did Braham see then? What was created in his mind? Was this an independent entity? And I'd like you to think for a second about this. You could turn around and say it was an hallucination. But think about how hallucinations work. There are 2 hallucinations taking place here, aren't there? There's the hallucination of him seeing the creature in the chair, but there's also the hallucination, the fact of taking out information. Because if I hallucinate you there sitting in the chair, I cannot see the chair behind you. So the chair behind you has been taken out of my consciousness field, as well as me seeing the hallucination. Now this is a fascinating idea. It's called a metachoric model. And Celia Green was one of the people that actually worked on this, and the idea that hallucinations are far more peculiar and powerful than we believe them to be. So the question is, again, there seems to be something there that's expanded into 3-dimensional space that seems to have independent existence of your consciousness. What I suggest is that in some way, again, and it's an area I'm thinking about for a future book, is that these entities seem to be able to create something from our fear. They seem to feed on fear. They seem to be aware if they can frighten you, it seems to generate something within themselves. So this is where I'm going with my writing at the moment. In terms of my overall philosophy on this, I genuinely, when I started writing the book, I really wanted just an explanation for my mother's experience. Now, some of you will know and will say that there is an explanation for this. It's called Charles Bonnet syndrome. Has anybody come across Charles Bonnet syndrome at all? Okay. Charles Bonnet syndrome was actually analysed by a guy called Charles Bonnet. It's always fascinating, isn't it, how these people find things that are named after themselves. It's real synchronicity and coincidence. Charles Bonnet noticed that his grandfather, Charles Lullin, when he was in his 70s, started describing seeing these strange creatures, and he would sit there and he would see beautiful women walking through his living room with huge hats on. It is now known that Charles Bonnet syndrome is a precursor for Alzheimer's disease. And one of the things that happened with my mother before she saw the alien was she called on me one day. I called round to see her, and she said that she turned around to me and she said, "The little children have stopped singing. They don't sing anymore to me." And I'm thinking, is she letting children in from the house? You know, what's going on here? And she said, no, there's children. They're little children, and they follow me round, and they laugh and they giggle, and they're happy people. And she said, they're not quite as friendly as the old man in the kitchen. He's very, very friendly. And I'm thinking, is she letting other people into the house? But this is part of Charles Bonnet syndrome. But what intrigues me here is the little children, the size of the creatures that people see in Charles Bonnet syndrome. And it's not just to do with elderly people. People that get classic migraines sometimes see these things as well, in part of their pre-migraine aura. There are also people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy that seem to see these things. And there seems to be a link between this and shamanism. And in the book I have a whole section on shamanism, including some people I know who are practicing shamans who have explained to me exactly what is going on in these circumstances. So what we seem to have here is something quite strange, and something that again goes through history. And the other area of the book I really focus in on is the little people, the fae, the fairies, the little creatures that people have reported throughout history. What are they? They're universal. You find them in most cultures around the world. These creatures seem to have independent existence again. They seem to have a degree of malevolence, but also a degree of support for human beings. And people, again, experience these things when they take mind-altering substances such as dimethyltryptamine. As Terence McKenna said, you know, they are the machine elves. You take DMT, you see elves. Everybody sees elves. It's what they see. But why do they see elves? I want to dig a little bit deeper. I want to know what it is. What are these archetypes and why are they there? What is it telling us neurologically about the way the human brain works? The archons really fascinate me, just for everybody who's not into Gnosticism. Archons, the example I always like to give is if you watch the movie The Matrix, Agent Smith is an archon. It's kind of a creation to manipulate, to keep us controlled within this environment.
Did you say they're artificial intelligence then, or...?
It's an interesting point again, and it's one of the questions that I try to answer in the book, is if they seem to have independent of existence of ourselves, and they seem to have motivations that are different to ourselves, it suggests that they are independent of us. It suggests that they have ulterior motives. But what those motives are, I don't know. There's a friend of mine who's an American writer, and he has the idea, again, the thing I pointed on before, that they exist to actually create fear, and by creating fear they actually feed off the energy that we give off as fear. And I know that in esoteric traditions that's actually been believed for a long, long time.
Would that be the same thing as a jinn or a Valon?
Yes. Yeah, jinns, again, I have a section on jinns, because again they intrigue me, because they again seem to have come out of the kind of the Middle Eastern belief system within the desert peoples. And jinn are extremely interesting, because I was not aware that there's different types. And there's 4 or 5 different types. There's black jinns and blue jinns and gin and tonics. No, sorry, I didn't help that one. But they seem to have this kind of power. Now again, it's the question, do people just make these things up because it's a nice, good story? Now I don't believe this. I don't believe that cultures and civilizations just make these things up. It's generally based upon experiential things. And I always say to people, we exist in this kind of cosseted world where we're in boxes, we're surrounded by walls and carpets and everything, and we drive around in our cars to spend a night under the stars on a summer's evening. Suddenly you're then in touch with the telluric forces within the ground, within the world, and I'll guarantee you will see things and feel things that are not natural. In the book, I have a fascinating section where a guy wrote to me, and he was doing an archaeological dig round Heathrow Airport. And while he was doing the archaeological dig, he used to wander around in the mornings, early morning. And he said he was wandering around early one morning, and he said suddenly the air around him was electric. And there were kind of things in the air all around him. Aerial spirits, and they were flying around him. Now this guy's a scientist, and he was explaining to me this was the most peculiar thing that had ever happened to him. It was as if a window had opened to another world that abuts this one. And because the conditions were right, they seemed to come through. Now again, as he argued, he said he started to read up about these things, and apparently this area had a reputation for having these things since medieval times. But he didn't know that at the time. So again, that's to me proof that whatever he experienced was somehow there within the ground around. Now we know, the memory of stones. We know that the environment that we exist within, there seems to be some kind of power force that we can sense sometimes. And I think these elementals are somehow part of that.
Can I ask a question about sort of female icons that apparently appear, either say Our Lady of Lourdes or
There's a section on that as well.
Lucia Santos in Iberia or Guadalupe.
Yeah.
I mean, would you say these come out of the present, out of the past, or out of the future? I mean,
the whole concept of BVMs, as they're known, Blessed Virgin Marys, is again a whole chapter in the book. And I'm quite intrigued by this, because if you start looking into what was reported, for instance, at Fatima, you will find a lot of these BVM situations, they seem to be around caves. Caves seem to be the crucial thing, and I found a consistent theme. There was the cave, at Fatima with the 3 children when they actually saw the Virgin Mary, which of course the beings themselves never actually turn around and say that they're the Virgin Mary. They're interpreted as being the Virgin Mary, but if you actually start looking back into the history, you'll find that the cave that it happened in has a name that suggests that there was actually a female presence in that place and had been seen for and pre-Christian times. So clearly this is something that's always been there, that seems to manifest at certain times. And when it manifests, we apply our understanding of how the world works. And of course, in 18th and 19th century France, it's going to be interpreted as being something to do with Christianity, something to do with Catholicism in that way. But of course, if you start reading, you'll find that, for instance, in Fatima, the amazing incidents with the sun spinning in the sky and coming down and supposedly drying all, because it had rained, and everybody's clothing dried. Now, obviously, it wasn't the sun that was spinning.
Is it possible that they, say with relation to the Fatima, which was witnessed by maybe up to 100,000?
It was.
I mean, could they be coming out of the future rather than coming out of the past?
That's a possibility. I mean, effectively, if you take the argument of Minkowski and block time, for instance, the idea that effectively there's a permanent present, and time is, as Einstein said, an illusion. We actually see the present and the future can overlap. Now, I've had my own experiences of these things where time seems to have changed, and in my book, The Labyrinth of Time, I gave an example where I was in southern Turkey, near the Menderes River, and I was sitting on the top of an old deserted mosque, and suddenly the air around me shivered, and what had been a valley, the Menderes Valley, suddenly became an elbow of the sea, and it was full of water, and one of the hills in the hillside was an island. And then I swore, and I still swear to this day, I started seeing a Greek tyrammy coming around the side of it, and then I snapped out of it. Now, what was
a Greek
tyrammy? It was one of the kind of boats with the kind of thing in the front, a triumph, is that how you pronounce it? But I found that quite intriguing, and I particularly found it intriguing because a few weeks later there was an article written in the Sunday Times magazine where somebody had almost an identical experience in the same location. And we know that Arnold Toynbee had a similar experience as well in Greece, where he found himself going back into the past. And it seems that the past could be, so it could be time slips. Yeah, it could be an overlapping of different times, and that's a possibility. In terms of crop circles, I'm very much a skeptic on that. and I'm a skeptic because I've done a series of talks in that area for crop circle groups, and I know for a fact from the people who live in that area and the hoteliers in that area that there are groups of people that come over and actually do the crop circles, and I was told that quite categorically. Now, who knows whether that really is the truth? I don't know. But I find it very strange that aliens will travel halfway across the universe to actually sort of flatten some grass and put some geometric symbols on there. And the way in which the geometric symbols have become more complex as time has gone on. From originally, you know, the original mowing devil that they actually had in 17th century England, they've now come into these incredibly complex things. Now, it could be that you wouldn't have sufficient time to do them, but I still have to question motivation in terms of that. In terms of Rendlesham, Rendlesham has always intrigued me. There's elements of Rendlesham I don't fully understand, and funnily enough, I'll be doing an event in California next May, where I'll be talking with two of the guys that were actually involved at Rendlesham as well, so it's going to be very intriguing to do that. So the general answer is, isn't it, it was the lighthouse off the coast, and they could see it through there. But that doesn't explain how they seemingly thought they'd seen the device much closer.
And one of the gentlemen touched the machine, and there were symbols on it.
So he claimed, yeah, that's the issue. There's been a lot of questions about the veracity of a lot of them, and I don't know the case in depth enough, but I know friends who have researched it. I really am not sure about Roswell. We all know that the Ray Santilli video that was brought out, which was shown to be a fake, rather eroded that slightly, I think. But it doesn't mean that I'm not interested in it, because ufology has been an interest of mine since I was a child. So I've followed a lot of these cases through the years, although it's not been in my writing until this book, but it is an area that I'm quite interested in. I do indeed, and I think just in terms of just an explanation, the Julian James bicameral mind was the idea that up until a certain point in time, our brains were singular rather than bicameral. There wasn't two sections to the brain. And he uses analysis because there is no concept of self when you read the Iliad and books like that. It's always the voice of the gods that are actually telling people to do things, and that was because we were hearing our own inner dialogue and interpreting it as being the voice of the gods. But it does seem to me that ancient civilizations seem to have had something we don't necessarily understand yet in terms of form of communication and understanding of their natural environment. In previous talks, I've always used the analogy of if somebody in Victorian times dug up a CD-ROM, they would have no idea. They would just think it was a mirror or something that reflected things. And I sometimes wonder that things that we discover and ancient artifacts that we discover that we misinterpret, because what we do is we impose our own values, our own interpretations, our own culture onto that and say, oh, it's self-evidently what it is. The Antikythera device is one example, for instance, that was discovered in ancient Greece. We're not quite sure what that was about or what it was for, but it obviously is an incredibly complex mechanism. Clearly, I think our history goes back far further than we understand. I mean, water damage on the side of the Sphinx, for instance, gives examples of the Robert Schoch ideas. So clearly there is something here, and I know that our groups were very, very interested in get to these strange ideas. I mean, for instance, we did an event last April at the Platos Caves in Staffordshire, where we tried to recreate the whole myth of Platos Cave, and we're planning to recreate this again in the future, because we believe this gives people the opportunity to actually go into a cave-like environment in the darkness, to actually start to appreciate and to tune into your own something else. Now, I argue in the book that there is so much evidence of people that seem to go into caves. Caves seem to be the standard thing. I mean, there are tribes in Latin America, and what they do is the children are put in darkness for the first 6 or 7 years of their life. And I believe this is to generate melatonin. It's to make melatonin be generated more effectively within the brain, because I argue, and I've argued in previous books, that melatonin in the brain can be synthesized from melatonin into what we call metatonin, which is endogenous dimethyltryptamine. And the argument is that we can generate our own hallucinogenic states. And as Rick Strassman has said, one of the major writers on the subject of dimethyltryptamine, he has argued that dimethyltryptamine is in fact our reality regulator. That the reason we create this external world is because the dimethyltryptamine within our brains is actually creating this external world in one way or another. Which then comes right back again to the point I was making before about the researchers at Imperial College, because here we have people who are going out-of-body experiences into alternate realities, experiencing entities in those circumstances, and coming back and bringing back the information from those entities. To me, this is evidence that there is something very, very peculiar going on in terms of the human brain.
Are there books on this?
On this?
Are there books on it?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, my own book, Opening the Doors of Perception, deals with this. But there are also people in the room who are involved in this research, because, you know, I'm not going to point people out, but there are people involved in the room who are involved in this. And it's really intriguing stuff. And I think what it's doing is it's changing the paradigm. We're at the point now where suddenly these things are breaking through. They're breaking through into the zeitgeist. People are writing about them. People are making movies about them. It's time that we started to realise that the label theory of science does not work anymore. We have to understand exactly what we mean when we say somebody is hallucinating. We have to understand completely when somebody goes into a lucid dream state, sees somebody in that lucid dream state, sees that person in consensual reality, and they both share the same experience, and they share it with each other. The only reason we believe this reality is consistent is because it's consensual. In other words, I turn around to you and I say, that book is black and it's called Black Mirror. You all agree. That's consensual. But what if a circumstance when you're in an out-of-body state, you meet somebody else and you both see the same thing, and then you come back into this reality and you agree that you saw the same thing? That means it's just as real as this is. I call it electromagnetic chauvinism. And I'll make one final point about electromagnetic chauvinism and an analogy, which I put in one of my books. The Mississippi River starts in a very small place in Minnesota. It then goes all the way through the centre of the United States till it comes out in the Gulf of Mexico, 3,000 miles or whatever. If that was equivalent to the electromagnetic spectrum, from radio waves to gamma rays, the world we think is real is the visual world of natural light, of light. The whole world we believe is real is 1.5 inches, 8 miles south of Hannibal, Missouri. Thank you.